This is going to be the second part of the lecture on air pollution. So, what is the overall effect of air pollution? Now, remember we were also talking about particulated material or particulated matter. Now, particulated matter that is smaller than 2.5 microns in diameter can easily penetrate the lung epithelium and enter the blood circulation. That is because the intercellular gap of the epithelial cells of alveoli in human lung is larger than 2.5 microns. So because of that, any particulated gaseous material that is present in the atmosphere that is inhaled into the lungs will easily pass to the blood circulation without any problem, without any physical barrier. Now, what happens when you inhale this particulated material? It is linked to many other health complications, heart attacks, asthma, or increasing incidences of asthma, um, lung cancer. Probably we know that cancers actually has a genetic background, but also there's an environmental component. So presence of particulated material in the lungs and the bloodstream could be the stimulation for a lung cancer, and also we know that certain material in the maternal bloodstream can also pass through the fetus and enter the can pass through the placenta and enter the fetus and thereby influence the fetal development. So many complications arise if you inhale particulated material that is smaller than 2.5 microns. Now, what are the sources of this particulated material? Diesel vehicles, right? So I think in North America, diesel vehicles are not that popular, but we do know that there are a lot of 18 wheelers. Um, so most of those heavy trucks, 18 wheelers, those are driven by fueled by diesel, and diesel combustion engines need to be repaired quite often than gas-based engines. So if you don't, what happens is you get, a greater production of this particulated material that could create a major health hazard. And for humans, of course, these air pollutants, particularly the particulate material, is inhaled through the lungs. But for other animals, particularly for amphibians, fish, some particulate material can actually transfer through the skin, or it could be particulated material in the atmosphere could contaminate water, and from water it could contaminate the food and then ingested with food and water. So there are many ways air pollutants like particulated material can enter biological entities. Now, let's talk about some health effects that is coming up um, as a result of being exposed to air pollution. Bronchitis, a very well known disease condition, but let's understand the pathology of that a little bit with respect to air pollution. So first, what happens is presence many type of air pollutants that we have discussed so far, including the most critical ones. All of them, all the critical air pollutants can result in lung irritation, respiratory irritation of any part of the respiratory tract. Now, if the inflammation happens in the airways, what are the airways? Well, trachea is an airway, bronchioli, bronchi, air ducts, all of those tubes that conduct air from the nasal passage to the lungs are considered airways, right? What happens if the inflammation happens? If inflammation happens in the airways due to the irritant effect of the air pollutants, well, what is inflammation? Well, inflammation is sort of a primary level immune response, right? So when the airways gets inflamed as a kind of a reaction to soothe that, the airways will produce a lot more mucus. right? And also, some of those pollutants actually interfere with the circular muscles of the air ducts, or rather the smooth muscles of the air duct. In fact, circular muscles are type of an smooth muscle that you found around air duct. So when those smooth muscles uh, are tainted, contaminated with air pollutants, that could lead to a muscle spasm. So combination of these, induced pollutant induced muscle spasm and buildup of mucus in response to inflammation essentially reduces the hollow of the air duct and constricting the air duct, so that minimizes the air passage, right, through the airways. So that way it leads to two conditions. One, the alveoli, which is actually the gaseous exchange surface, gets a minimum supply of air. Two, whatever the air already present in the alveoli will be trapped there, because the air ducts are too small to passage that air back out of the body. So that actually reduces the metabolism of the individual, because you cannot respire properly, you cannot gain oxygen into your body properly. Then of course your metabolic rate goes down, your activities goes down, you become lethargic, lazy, feeling dizzy and giddy all the time. So this leads to many other behavioral complications as well. And also, given the fact that there is lots of mucus being secreted, and given the fact that there's inflammation, given the fact that there is a lot of damage, physical damage to the respiratory surface, it opens up the possibility for secondary infections of bacteria, right? So that could be also further much more devastating. Well, there's a lot of information about the impact of pollution on humans. So plants are too susceptible to air pollution. Right? We mentioned that certain pollutants like ozone, especially, can damage the cell membranes of plant cells, right? So that disrupts the cellular integrity, which also destroys the entire structure, histological structure of plant tissues. Um, so when the plant loses its cellular structure, every organelle within that cell also gets disrupted, particularly chloroplasts, which are membrane bound organelles within plant cells, and also for chlorophyll, which is a pigment found within chloroplast. So if these structures are damaged, what's happened to a plant? As you can see in this image, the plant loses its coloration first, and then the plant leaf dies because it cannot produce any more food. Um, and also, being exposed to a variety of air pollutants, kind of a cocktail air pollutants, increases plants' physiological stress. It's like the plant combating a disease. Because the pollution is extremely stressful for the plant, right? So when the plant is under physiological and environmental stress, it is much more susceptible to other plant pathogens, viruses, bacteria, fungi, and pests. So imagine the impact of air pollution on crops, right? Crops are plants. Although they are well looked after, well taken care of, well managed, still pollution is kind of beyond the control of the farmer. So, meaning air pollution can negatively affect the food production, because food production comes from primary production. A physiologically stressed plant that is devoid of chloroplasts, that undergoing chloroplast destruction, cellular damage, cannot sustain its photosynthesis to produce enough food. Now, let's take another look at what happens in acid deposition. So acid deposition can happen in two different ways. One is the dry acid deposition. The second one is the wet acid deposition. The wet acid deposition is also known as, acid precipitation, which happens through rain, hail, snow, and ice. So what happens here first? These acidic gases, such as sulfur oxides nitrogen oxides that are emitted from motor vehicles or from industries are released to atmosphere, and they keep rising in the atmosphere, and ultimately in the upper atmosphere, they can actually combine with other particulated pollutants as well, and then some of them can actually interact with water vapor or water inside clouds, and kind of contaminated the precipitation process. Or some of those pollutants in the air can travel with the air circulation and physically, be deposited on the earth, on the ground, on water, simply by the gravitational pull. So both forms of dry and wet deposition um, can happen to acidic compounds that's present in the air as a pollutant, right? And we already discussed the ill effects of that to the environment, to the ecosystem, as well as for organisms. And acid deposition is today considered as a key reason for many forest diebacks all over the world, including in the tropical climates. It's kind of interesting to think about where does the acidic gases comes in tropical climates, because most of the tropical countries are not industrialized, right? They are largely agriculture driven, and so which brings up the point. So those gaseous acidic pollutants can also move from one source to another through atmospheric circulation. So acid pollution or acid deposition is not simply a local process. It could happen across the world, and pollutants arising from one of the factories in China could actually kill forests in India. And in fact, this has happened in tropical South Asian and Southeastern Asian rainforests, where the forests are suffering death, or forest dieback happens um, due to increased acidity in the soil. um, but those countries, those South and South Asian countries, are not the source of the pollutants. It's somewhere else. The map you are looking at right now shows the global scale vulnerability for acid deposition. In other words, the red colored ones, the red colored areas in the map are the areas that are currently known to suffer from acid deposition. Okay, the yellow areas in future could potentially suffer from acid deposition and other forms of air pollution. Okay, the green areas um, are the areas that actually are also susceptible to atmospheric deposition, and also have very sensitive soil um, that could be more negatively impacted by acid deposition. So what is the problem that I'm trying to highlight here? Take a look at the green areas. Again, what do you mean by green areas? Green areas are the areas that have sensitive soil, right? And those green areas are also somewhat susceptible to receive acid deposition, right? Now, what do I mean by sensitive soil? Meaning soil that are unable to buffer acid rains, okay? Because okay, let's think about what buffers acid rains. Okay, acid rain decreases pH, so you need to have some sort of a calcium based um, soil that actually has alkaline property. Okay, the calcium based salts like calcium carbonates, calcium bicarbonates can actually hydrolyze and produce some sort of an alkalinity that can neutralize the acidity, right? But the areas that you see in green has a lot of ancient bedrock cover that has not undergo weathering. So those soil that have a greater proportion of bedrocks may be unable to release alkaline salts to neutralize the effects of acidity. So out of all these areas in the map, right, the green areas could also suffer tremendously from acid rain simply because the soils cannot handle it. And also on top of that, we have these red areas. In the US, you can see it covers the entire eastern US seaboard and part of the northern Midwest around the Great Lake areas. Those areas are already having problems, right? And also Eastern Asia, again, those heavily industrialized areas, and also much of the Europe, um, even part of Scandinavia, right, are already having problems with acid deposition, right, because of their industrialized past. Um, so there are many, we are already encountering problems in the areas that are marked in red. Um, and in future, some of those green marked areas could actually also show some ecological damage, environmental problems due to acid deposition. Because simply again, because those areas, the soils in those environments, and then if you look at where you find the greens, largely you are looking at the tropical belt, tropical areas in South America, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Africa, right? Central Africa. So that area, largely the green colored areas, are tropical areas. And you also know that tropical areas naturally have acidic soil. So that soil can no longer handle further input of acids. So hence, my point is those green colored areas in future may become heavily impaired due to acid deposition if mitigatory measures, pollution prevention measures are not taken. Now, there are many examples that I can tell you about how damaging acid deposition can be. Let me take up my laser pointer here. So the top image, right, that you see over here, um, this is an example of forest dieback. Now, I explained you earlier what forest dieback is. It's a situation where um, massive number of trees lose its foliage and and die subsequently due to acid precipitation. In the image, you can see many dead standing trees without any canopy, without any foliage. That trees that actually succumbed to acid precipitation. On the image below, you are looking at several open patches of land where you can see the bare ground within a huge forest in a mountain slope. Now, those open patches indicates areas where trees have died due to acid precipitation. The impact of acid precipitation is a lot more severe in aquatic environments, particularly in freshwater environments. For example, if freshwater lakes pH drops in and around 5, okay, it could disrupt reproduction of many animals, both vertebrates and invertebrates. In addition, it could kill certain plants and alter the plant community structure in wetlands. From uh, it could remove all the pH sensitive, acid sensitive, acidity sensitive, alkaline plants and replace that with more acid tolerant plants. Many insects, particularly larval stages of insects, and many other invertebrates like crustaceans can disappear. So hence, the overall community structure of lakes can change due to acid deposition. If pH drops even further, below 5, fish species starts to die. Um, this has been observed in Norwegian and Swedish streams and lakes where the pH has dropped below 5. Many huge masses of fish suffered deaths. Um, in the Adirondack National Park of the US, in around the 1970s, um, more than 50% of the high altitude lakes became fishless because all the fish died because of exposure to high acidity. And similar observations are currently being made in Canada in lakes of Ontario and Quebec. And both of these environments have a large number of lakes, and those lakes are actually sources of biodiversity, aquatic biodiversity. But with the acid precipitation going on in these environments, those unique Northern American lake biodiversity could disappear forever. And a similar situation in Towers Hump Mountains of Vermont in 1980s suffered or showed evidences of reduced seedling production and seedling survival, and which then led into reduced tree recruitment, reduced tree density in forests, where the forest became less denser, and then also subsequently, the viability of the spruce fir forests also declined. Now, remember, spruce fir forests are adapted to live in relatively highly acidic environments, but we are talking about an example where even even plants like coniferous spruce fir communities that can tolerate acidity to a certain level could not handle any more increased acidity due to acid precipitation. And again, going back to the image that I showed you earlier, that image came from Mount Mission National Park of North Carolina, where forest diebacks are happening within the recent half the decade due to acid precipitation. Now, again, North Carolina of US, it's a part of the northeastern US. Those areas, particularly the southern Appalachian Mountains, that is a local biodiversity hotspot. Imagine the impact to other species living in that environment, the unique biodiversity, the endemic salamanders and reptiles. What happens to those if their habitat changes dramatically because of acid deposition? So how do we control air pollution? I think we mentioned on several occasions that the Clean Air Act of the United States, mandated by EPA, is one of the first national scale endeavors to control air pollution. And this act helps us to identify critical air pollutants, the so-called criteria pollutants that I mentioned previously in the lecture. That identifying those six air pollutants, came up because of the influences of the Clean Air Act. And also this act led to establishment of the tolerable quantities of air pollutants that can remain in the atmosphere. In other words, it led to establishment of air pollution standards and air pollution monitoring techniques and need to monitor air pollution and to take action. So all of these came up because of the Clean Air Act. And in fact, I know that several other countries adopted similar policies that are parallel to Clean Air Act all over the world, in Asia, in parts of South America, um, part of Eastern Asia, to mitigate air pollution. It's actually a success story. And in fact, there were amendments made later on to the Clean Air Act, which actually helped to combat acid deposition, urban air pollution, emission or releasing toxic um, pollutants to the atmosphere, and also to fight back ozone depletion, right? And if you remember ozone depletion, we talked about that several times, okay? Because um, due to the production of chlorofluorocarbons, coolants in refrigerators, air conditioners, and perfumes, those chlorofluorocarbons that are used as a coolant or a diffusant in those devices, as those devices fail, they are released to the atmosphere, and that led to that actually resulted in a damage to the ozone layer in the upper atmosphere, and which actually um, increased the penetration of harmful UVB radiation to the lower atmosphere, right? And that's is the consequence of ozone depletion in the Earth's atmosphere. And speaking of ozone depletion, the Montreal Protocol, which is actually a protocol that was initiated to combat ozone depletion, it's an international agreement signed in 1987 by participation of over 100 countries. That was one of the most successful international endeavors, which at global scale was able to ban production of chlorofluorocarbons or other similar um, halogen-based coolants or diffusants, right? So today, you will never find a refrigerator or an air conditioner based on chlorofluorocarbons, right? Because it's banned, and even the industrial world quickly re-engineered their technology to produce alternative coolants. So that was a success story. So what I'm trying to say is environmental policies that operate at national scale and international agreements have worked very successfully in the past. And today, because we stopped releasing chlorofluorocarbons, the ozone layer is healing. It's repairing itself because for the last decade, not a single molecule of CFC was released from the atmosphere from the Earth. Um, so we also talked about this particulated organic matter. How do we remove particulated organic matter? So removal of those can be done by actually having some sort of a porous mesh around those air chimneys or air passages that exhaust industrial emissions into the atmosphere. So essentially, you need to have some sort of a filter to hold back the particulated material that could be. Um, and we also, going back to the theme of climate change, right, and which is a very critical part of air pollution. So we emphasized emphasized this previously, but I'm re-emphasizing it now. We have to re-engineer our energy consumption, right? Reduce electricity consumption, right? By it could be as simple as insulating houses, buildings, offices, right? And also redesigning a public transportation system, right? That actually prevents individuals driving their own vehicles. Like when individuals drive on their cars, that's increasing not only the carbon footprint but also the pollution footprint. Like imagine if we had a better, more efficient public transportation system, there will be fewer cars on the road. And we need to come up with a new environmental technology and kind of an environmental engineering technology, um, which effectively removes contaminants like sulfur and heavy metal like lead or mercury from fossil fuels. Right now we do have means of extract, decontaminating fossil fuel, but the result is, the air pollution where the pollutants are released to the atmosphere. No, we have to re-engineer and re-devise new technologies, um, where those contaminants can be safely removed and stored safely somewhere without being exposed to the atmosphere. And also, speaking of nitrogen oxides and pollution of nitrogen oxides, pollution stemming from oxides of nitrogen, how do you stop that? We know that nitrogen oxides are formed when fossil fuels and organic matter is burnt at extremely high temperature, right? But what if we reduce the temperature in burners, in combustion engines, by using certain catalysts to decrease the energy level? Then, of course, the nitrogen oxide formation will never happen, right? So there are many ways we can engineer and kind of reinvent the technology, or rather, kind of revisit the technology so that pollution can be mitigated successfully.